In 1420, the King of France signed a treaty that erased France from existence. Charles VI, known to history as Charles the Mad, put his name to a document that disinherited his own son, declared his own dynasty illegitimate, and handed the French crown to the King of England. When Charles died, France would simply cease to exist as an independent kingdom. It would be absorbed into a combined Anglo-French realm, ruled forever by English kings. The heir to the French throne, the Dauphin Charles, the king's own son, was declared a bastard, stripped of his inheritance, and forced to flee south with whatever loyalists would still follow him. Half of France was already under English occupation. Paris was in English hands. The great nobles had switched sides or been killed. The French army had been destroyed. It was over. France had lost, except it wasn't over. Because 9 years later, a 17-year-old peasant girl who claimed to hear the voices of saints would ride out of obscurity, rally the broken French forces, and begin the most improbable military comeback in European history. Her name was Joan of Arc, and her story is just one chapter in a conflict so vast, so bloody, so transformative that it reshaped the entire medieval world. The 100 Years' War wasn't really one war. It was a series of conflicts, truces, and renewed hostilities that stretched from 1337 to 1453, 116 years, though who's counting at that point? It killed millions of people, devastated the French countryside, bankrupted multiple kingdoms, and ultimately determined whether Western Europe would be dominated by one superpower or divided among competing nations. It saw some of the most famous battles in military history: Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt. It produced legendary figures: the Black Prince, Henry V, Joan of Arc. It witnessed the death of the medieval knight and the birth of modern warfare. It created the national identities of both England and France. And it started, as so many catastrophes do, with a family dispute. To understand why the King of England believed he had the right to rule France, you need to go back to 1066 and the most famous invasion in English history. When William the Conqueror crossed the English Channel and defeated King Harold at the Battle of Hastings, he didn't stop being the Duke of Normandy. He simply added King of England to his titles. For the next several centuries, the English kings were also French nobles, holding territories in France that they ruled as vassals of the French king. This created an inherently awkward situation. The King of England was, in his capacity as Duke of Normandy and later Duke of Aquitaine, Count of Anjou, and various other titles, technically subordinate to the King of France. He owed homage for his French lands. He was supposed to defer to French royal authority. But he was also a king in his own right, and kings don't like deferring to anyone. The situation became even more complicated in the 12th century, when Henry II of England married Eleanor of Aquitaine, adding her vast domains in southwestern France to the English crown. At its height, the Angevin Empire, as historians call this collection of territories, stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees. The English king controlled more of France than the French king did. Over the following century, the French kings clawed back most of these territories. King John of England, the villain of the Robin Hood legends, lost Normandy, Anjou, and other northern possessions to Philip II of France. By the early 14th century, English holdings in France had shrunk to Gascony, a wine-producing region in the southwest around Bordeaux. But Gascony remained, and with it, the fundamental problem. The English king was still technically a vassal of the French king for these lands. He still owed homage. He was still, in legal theory, a subordinate. English kings hated this. They looked for any opportunity to escape the obligation, to assert their independence, to reverse the humiliating losses of the past. In 1328, that opportunity arrived. When King Charles IV of France died in February 1328, he left no sons. This was a problem. Actually, it was a catastrophe. Charles IV was the last of the Capetian dynasty's direct male line the family that had ruled France for over 3 centuries. His death created a succession crisis that would ultimately kill millions of people. There were 2 main claimants to the throne. The first was Philip of Valois, a nephew of the previous king through the male line. He was French, lived in France, and had powerful French nobles supporting him. The second was Edward III of England. His claim came through his mother, Isabella, who was the sister of the dead king. By strict rules of inheritance, Edward had a stronger claim. He was the nephew of Charles IV, closer in blood than Philip of Valois. But there was a catch. Edward's claim came through a woman. And French lawyers argued that women could not transmit the right to inherit the crown, even if they couldn't hold it themselves. They cited an obscure Frankish law code called the Salic Law, which had never actually been applied to the French succession, but was now conveniently discovered to exclude female line claims. The French nobility chose Philip of Valois, who became Philip VI. Edward III was 14 years old at the time, and England was in the grip of a regency government. He was in no position to press his claim by force, so he accepted the situation for now. He even traveled to France in 1329 to perform homage to Philip for his Gascon lands, kneeling before the French king as a subordinate. But Edward never forgot. He never accepted that he had been cheated of his inheritance. And as he grew into manhood and took control of his kingdom, he waited for the right moment to press his claim. That moment came in 1337. The immediate cause of the war was a dispute over Gascony again. Philip VI demanded that Edward surrender a French noble who had fled to England after a dispute with the French crown. Edward refused. Philip declared Edward's Gascon lands forfeit. Edward responded by reasserting his claim to the French throne. In November 1337, Edward formally declared himself the rightful king of France. This wasn't just posturing. Edward genuinely believed he had been robbed of his inheritance. He quartered the French royal arms with the English ones, placing the French lily in the position of honor. He began styling himself King of France and England France first because it was the more prestigious title. The war that followed would last for generations, but it didn't start well for Edward. The early campaigns were expensive failures. English armies marched around northern France, burning and looting, but achieving little of strategic value. The French avoided pitched battles, letting the English exhaust themselves against fortified cities. Money ran out. Allies proved unreliable. By 1340, Edward was so deeply in debt that he had to leave his wife and children as collateral with his Flemish creditors while he returned to England to raise more funds. It was humiliating. It was unsustainable. Something had to change, and then came Crécy. The Battle of Crécy, fought on August 26, 1346, was one of the most decisive military engagements of the medieval period. It demonstrated, in the most brutal possible way, that the age of the armored knight was ending. Edward had landed in Normandy in July with an army of perhaps 15,000 men. He marched through northern France, pillaging as he went, drawing the French army after him. Philip VI gathered an enormous host, estimates range from 20 to 40,000, and pursued. The French caught up with the English near the village of Crécy, in Picardy. Edward had chosen his ground carefully, a ridge overlooking a gentle slope, with his flanks protected by terrain features. His army was tired and outnumbered, but it was also well disciplined and fighting from a strong defensive position, and it had long bows. The English longbow was a terrifyingly effective weapon. A trained archer could loose 10 to 12 arrows per minute, with enough force to penetrate armor at close range. The arrows themselves were cheap and plentiful. An army of 5,000 longbowmen could put 50,000 arrows in the air every minute. The French army was built around armored knights' heavy cavalry that expected to charge enemy formations and shatter them through sheer impact. They had crossbowmen too, but crossbows were slower, with a rate of fire of perhaps 2 shots per minute. What happened at Crécy was less a battle than a massacre. The French sent their Genoese crossbowmen forward first, but the crossbows had been damaged by rain, and the bowstrings were wet. Their shots fell short. The English arrows did not. The crossbowmen broke and fled. The French knights, impatient and contemptuous of these mercenary commoners, rode them down and charged the English lines. They never got there. The arrow storm was apocalyptic. Horses screamed and fell. Knights tumbled from their saddles. Those who made it close to the English lines found themselves facing dismounted men-at-arms and stakes planted to break cavalry charges. The ground became a tangle of dead and dying horses, men struggling in heavy armor, chaos, and slaughter. The French charged again, and again some sources claim 15 or 16 separate attacks, and each time they were shot to pieces before they could close. Philip VI himself was wounded. The flower of French chivalry died in the mud. When the sun rose the next morning, somewhere between 10 and 15,000 French soldiers lay dead on the field, including over 1,500 knights and nobles. The English had lost perhaps 200 men. It was unprecedented. It was incomprehensible. The greatest warriors in Christendom had been slaughtered by common archers' peasants, effectively killing their social superiors from a distance without even the courtesy of hand-to-hand combat. The medieval world had just received a brutal lesson about the future of warfare. Edward followed up his victory by besieging Calais, the major port city across the English Channel from Dover. The siege lasted nearly a year. The defenders held out heroically, eating horses, then rats, then worse. When they finally surrendered in August 1347, Edward demanded the heads of 6 leading citizens as the price of sparing the town. According to legend, the burghers of Calais walked out of the city with ropes around their necks, expecting execution. Edward's queen, Philippa, supposedly intervened, begging for their lives on her knees. Edward relented. The 6 burghers survived, but Calais fell into English hands, and it would remain English for the next centuries. It became the primary gateway for English armies entering France, a fortified beachhead from which future campaigns would launch. Edward was at the height of his power. France was reeling. A decisive peace seemed within reach, and then the world ended. The Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347, spreading from Genoese trading ships that had fled plague-stricken ports in the Crimea. Within 5 years, it killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. 25 million dead, perhaps more. Entire villages wiped out. Cities losing half their inhabitants in months. Bodies piling up faster than they could be buried. Social order collapsing as priests fled their flocks and doctors fled their patients, and everyone who could run away ran away from everyone else. The war ground to a halt. You can't fight when your army is dying of plague. You can't collect taxes when your tax base is dead. You can't maintain political authority when people are convinced that God is punishing humanity for its sins. For several years, both England and France were too devastated to continue the conflict. Truces were signed, armies disbanded. Both kingdoms turned inward to deal with the catastrophe, but the plague passed eventually. The survivors picked up the pieces, and the war resumed. The renewal of hostilities came in 1355, led by one of the most remarkable military commanders of the age, Edward, the Black Prince. The nickname came from later centuries, possibly referring to the color of his armor, possibly to his reputation for ruthlessness. He was Edward III's eldest son, and he had fought at Crécy at just 16 years old. Now, in his mid-20s, he was given command of an English army in Gascony and told to cause as much damage as possible. He was very good at causing damage. The Black Prince launched a series of chevauchés devastating raids through French territory, burning crops, destroying villages, slaughtering livestock. The strategy was partly economic, deprive the French of resources, and partly psychological, demonstrate that the French king couldn't protect his own people. It was also phenomenally profitable. The raiders returned laden with plunder. War for the English was a business as much as a political project. In September 1356, the Black Prince was returning from one such raid when he was caught near Poitiers by a French army under King John II. Philip VI had died in 1350, and his son now wore the crown. The French had learned from Crécy, or thought they had. John dismounted most of his knights, hoping to avoid the horse-killing arrow storm that had destroyed the cavalry at Crécy. He outnumbered the English significantly, perhaps 3-1. He was confident of victory. He was wrong. The Battle of Poitiers, fought on September 19, 1356, was in some ways even more devastating than Crécy. The French advanced on foot, struggling through vineyards and hedgerows that broke up their formations. English archers shot into their flanks as they came. The fighting was brutal, hand-to-hand, hour after hour. The turning point came when the Dauphin Charles, the heir to the French throne, withdrew from the battle with his division. Whether this was cowardice, strategic prudence, or following orders is debated. What matters is that it broke French morale. Soldiers who saw the heir apparent leaving concluded the battle was lost. King John II did not flee. He fought on, surrounded by his bodyguard, until he was finally overwhelmed and captured. The King of France was a prisoner of the English. It was a humiliation beyond anything France had experienced. The sovereign, God's anointed ruler, dragged off to captivity in a foreign land. The symbolism was devastating. The practical consequences were worse. The Black Prince treated his prisoner with exquisite courtesy. They dined together. John was called my lord and given precedence at table, but he was still a prisoner, and prisoners could be ransomed. The price for King John II was set at 3 million écus, an almost inconceivable sum, equivalent to twice the annual revenue of the French crown. It would take years to raise, and France would have to surrender vast territories in addition to the money. France was prostrate. Its king was a captive. Its armies were destroyed. Its treasury was empty. And in Paris, something even more dangerous was brewing. The capture of the king created a power vacuum that nearly destroyed the French state from within. The Dauphin Charles, just 18 years old, with a reputation for cowardice after Poitiers, was left to govern a kingdom in collapse. The nobles blamed each other for the defeats. The common people blamed the nobles. The Estates General, the French Representative Assembly, demanded reforms and oversight of royal spending. A Parisian merchant named Etienne Marcel emerged as the leader of a revolutionary movement. He accused the royal government of corruption and incompetence. He demanded that the Estates General control taxation and that the Dauphin's councillors be purged. When the Dauphin resisted, Marcel's followers invaded the royal palace and murdered 2 of the Dauphin's marshals in front of him, spattering the prince with their blood. For a moment, it seemed like France might tear itself apart. The peasantry rose in a brutal Jacqueria peasant revolt, slaughtering nobles and burning chateaux. The nobles struck back with equal brutality. Marcel allied with the English-backed claimant to the throne, Charles of Navarre, essentially committing treason against the French crown. The Dauphin fled Paris, gathered loyal forces, and waited. Marcel's movement collapsed when his alliance with the English became public. He was assassinated by his own followers in July 1358. The Jacquerie was crushed with massive bloodshed. Charles returned to Paris, shaken but still in power. He had survived the worst crisis a French monarch had faced in centuries. In 1359, Edward III launched what he intended to be the final campaign, a massive invasion aimed at capturing Reims, where French kings were traditionally crowned, and claiming the French throne once and for all. It didn't work. The French refused to give battle. They stayed behind their walls, letting Edward's army march around the countryside, accomplishing nothing. The weather was terrible, supplies ran short. The campaign that was supposed to end the war fizzled into frustration. Edward accepted that he couldn't conquer France outright, but he could negotiate from strength. The Treaty of Bretigny, signed in 1360, was supposed to end the 100 Years' War. Under its terms, Edward gave up his claim to the French throne in exchange for full sovereignty over Gascony and the surrounding regions, about a third of France, held free and clear without any homage to the French king. The ransom for King John was reduced, though it remained enormous. It was a disaster for France, but it was peace. The fighting stopped. King John was eventually released. He would later voluntarily return to English captivity and die there, a strange coda to a strange reign. Edward had one, if not everything he wanted, then more than enough. The Peace of Bretigny lasted less than a decade. The problem was that the treaty was never fully ratified. Key provisions, including the formal renunciation of Edward's claim to the French throne, were supposed to be confirmed in a later agreement that never materialized. Both sides found reasons to delay. Both sides used the ambiguity to their advantage. The Dauphin Charles had become King Charles V in 1364, and he proved to be one of the most capable rulers in French history. He was not a warrior, his health was poor, and he rarely took the field personally, but he was a brilliant administrator and strategist. Charles rebuilt the French army, placing it under the command of Bertrand du Guesclin, a Breton knight of relatively humble origins, but exceptional military talent. Du Guesclin understood that the English couldn't be beaten in pitched battle crazy, and Poitiers had proven that. Instead, he adopted a strategy of attrition. Avoid major engagements, pick off isolated garrisons, raid supply lines, make the English pay for every inch of territory they held. It was unglamorous. It was slow, but it worked. One by one, the English-held territories began to fall. Charles V exploited legal technicalities to declare the peace void. He allied with Castile, whose fleet destroyed English naval power at the Battle of La Rochelle in 1372. He reconquered Poitou, Saintonge, much of Gascony. By the time Charles V died in 1380, England's continental possessions had shrunk to a handful of coastal enclaves: Calais in the north, Bordeaux and Bayonne in the south, a few other scattered strongholds. The great victories of Crécy and Poitiers had been erased. The Treaty of Bretigny was dead. Everything Edward III had won was lost. The Black Prince had died in 1376, his health broken by campaigning in Spain. Edward III himself died in 1377, senile and neglected, his great conquests undone. The crown passed to Richard II, a child of 10. England and France both entered periods of internal turmoil. The war continued in fits and starts, but neither side had the strength for decisive action. For a generation, the conflict simmered without resolution. Truces were signed and broken, raids and counter-raids crossed the Channel. But the great campaigns were over, or so it seemed. And then madness descended on the French throne. Charles VI became King of France in 1380 at the age of 11. He showed early promise. As he grew into manhood, he was handsome, athletic, and eager to rule. He took personal control of the government in 1388, dismissing the regents who had dominated his minority. He made peace with England through a series of truces. He seemed destined to complete the recovery his father had begun. And then, in the summer of 1392, he went insane. The first episode came without warning. Charles was leading an army through a forest in Brittany when a ragged man emerged from the trees and grabbed his horse's bridle, shouting that the king had been betrayed. The guards drove the man away, but Charles was shaken. Hours later, as the army rode through the heat of the day, a page accidentally dropped a lance, which clanged against a helmet. Charles snapped. He drew his sword and began attacking his own entourage, screaming that he was surrounded by enemies. He killed several men before he could be restrained. When he finally collapsed from exhaustion, he didn't recognize anyone around him. He didn't know who he was. The madness would recur throughout his life, sometimes lasting days, sometimes months. During his lucid periods, Charles was capable of governing. During his mad periods, he believed he was made of glass and would shatter if touched. He forgot his own name. He forgot he was king. He ran through the corridors of his palace, howling until he had to be restrained by servants. France was now ruled by a madman. The king's incapacity created a power vacuum that the French nobility rushed to fill. Two factions emerged, each centered on a powerful prince of the royal blood. The first was led by Louis, Duke of Orleans, the king's younger brother. Louis was charming, ambitious, and widely rumored to be having an affair with the Queen, Isabeau of Bavaria. He controlled access to the king during his lucid periods and dominated the royal council. The second faction gathered around John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, the king's cousin. Burgundy was one of the wealthiest and most powerful principalities in Europe, controlling not just the duchy itself, but also the rich cloth-producing regions of Flanders and the Low Countries. John was ruthless, calculating, and determined to control France. The rivalry between Orleans and Burgundy paralyzed the French government. Every decision became a battleground. Every appointment was contested. The royal treasury was looted by both sides to fund their political warfare. In 1407, John the Fearless decided to resolve the conflict permanently. He had Louis of Orleans assassinated in the streets of Paris. The murder was brazen and public. Masked men attacked Louis as he rode through the city at night, hacking him to pieces. John initially denied responsibility, then fled Paris, then brazenly admitted he had ordered the killing and justified it as tyrannicide, the legitimate execution of a tyrant. The confession should have destroyed him. Instead, it ignited a civil war. Louis's supporters rallied around his son, Charles of Orleans, and his father-in-law, the Count of Armagnac. They became known as the Armagnacs. John the Fearless and his Burgundian followers controlled Paris and much of northern France. The two factions fought with savage brutality throughout the 1410s. Armies marched and countermarched. Cities were sacked. Massacres became routine. The Armagnacs would take Paris, then the Burgundians would take it back, and each time there would be purges, executions, settling of scores. The Mad King was a puppet, wheeled out to legitimize whoever controlled him at any given moment. The Queen, Isabeau, switched sides repeatedly, selling her support to the highest bidder. The Dauphin, there were several, as older sons died and younger ones inherited the title, was a pawn in the game. France was tearing itself apart, and across the Channel, a new king of England was watching with hungry eyes. Henry V became King of England in 1413 at the age of 25. He was everything a medieval king was supposed to be: tall, athletic, pious, and utterly focused on military glory. He had already proven himself in battle, fighting Welsh rebels as a teenager and taking an arrow to the face at the Battle of Shrewsbury. The scar only added to his reputation. Henry inherited a kingdom that had been troubled by rebellion and instability since his father, Henry IV, had seized the throne from Richard II in 1399. The Lancastrian dynasty was new, its legitimacy questioned, its position insecure. Henry needed a great victory to cement his family's hold on power. He needed France. The French Civil War offered an irresistible opportunity. Both factions were bidding for English support, offering territorial concessions and diplomatic recognition. Henry played them against each other, extracting promises from both sides while preparing his invasion. In August 1415, Henry landed in Normandy with an army of about 12,000 men. His immediate target was Harfleur, a fortified port at the mouth of the Seine. The siege lasted longer than expected, 5 weeks of bitter fighting and devastating disease. By the time the city fell, Henry's army had been reduced to perhaps 9,000 men, many of them sick with dysentery. A sensible commander would have withdrawn, shipped the army back to England, and tried again next year. Henry marched toward Calais instead. The march to Calais was a desperate gamble. Henry was leading a weakened army through hostile territory, racing against the calendar as autumn turned toward winter. He needed to reach the English enclave before the French could gather enough forces to stop him. The French gathered enough forces to stop him. Near the village of Agincourt, on October 25, 1415, Henry's exhausted army found its path blocked by the largest French host assembled since Crécy. The numbers were overwhelming. The French had somewhere between 20 and 30,000 knights, men-at-arms, crossbowmen, the full military power of the French nobility. Henry had fewer than 9,000, and many of those were sick, starving, and barely able to stand. The French were confident. They had learned from Crécy and Poitiers. They would dismount their knights and advance on foot, eliminating the vulnerability to archery that had destroyed earlier armies. They would crush the English through sheer weight of numbers. They had not, however, learned about mud. The night before the battle, it rained. The field between the two armies was freshly plowed farmland. The rain turned it into a quagmire-ankle-deep mud that sucked at men's boots and clung to armor. When dawn came, Henry deployed his army across a narrow front between two patches of woodland. His archers drove sharpened stakes into the ground in front of their positions, a defensive measure against cavalry charges. And then he waited. The French didn't attack. They were waiting too, confident that time was on their side, expecting the starving English to withdraw or surrender. Henry couldn't wait. His men were dying of hunger and disease. Every hour that passed weakened him further. The English army moved forward across the muddy field until they were within extreme bowshot of the French lines. The archers replanted their stakes, and then they opened fire. The arrows forced the French to respond. They couldn't simply stand there being shot. The dismounted knights and men-at-arms began their advance across the muddy field. The heavily armored Frenchmen sank into the mud with every step. Their formation bunched together as the woodland on each side channeled them into a narrower and narrower front. The arrows never stopped falling, that same terrible arrow storm that had destroyed the French at Crécy 70 years earlier. Men fell. The men behind them tripped over the fallen. The formation compressed further until the French were so tightly packed they could barely swing their weapons. And still they struggled forward, through the mud, through the arrows, until they finally reached the English lines. The fighting was savage. Men wrestled in the muck, drowning in the mud beneath the weight of their armor. The English, lightly armored and more mobile, had the advantage. They struck at the gaps in French armor, pushed their enemies down, finished them with daggers. And the arrows kept falling, now aimed at the French rear, preventing reinforcements from reaching the fight. The French line broke. The first wave of attackers was destroyed, thousands of men killed or captured in a matter of hours. The second wave, seeing the slaughter, wavered and withdrew. During the battle, a rumor spread that the French were attacking the English baggage train. Henry, faced with thousands of French prisoners and the possibility of a renewed attack, made a terrible decision. He ordered the prisoners killed. It was a war crime by the standards of the time. Prisoners were supposed to be ransomed, not murdered. Knights had surrendered in good faith, expecting to be treated according to the chivalric code. Instead, English soldiers went among them with swords and axes, slaughtering men who were bound and helpless. Exactly how many died is unclear. Some English soldiers refused to carry out the order. Some prisoners were hidden by captors who wanted the ransom money. But hundreds, perhaps thousands, were killed in cold blood. Henry justified the decision as military necessity. He couldn't guard the prisoners and fight the French at the same time. If the prisoners had broken free during a renewed attack, they would have overwhelmed his army from within. Whether this justification was sincere or merely convenient is debated to this day. What's certain is that the massacre happened, and it shocked even that violent age. The casualties were staggering. Between 6 and 10,000 French soldiers died, including 3 dukes, at least 8 counts, and the Constable of France. Another 1,500 nobles were captured. An entire generation of French military leadership was wiped out in a single afternoon. Instead of uniting against the English invader, the Armagnacs and Burgundians kept fighting each other. John the Fearless saw the English victory as an opportunity to weaken his rivals. He made overtures to Henry, hinting at alliance, playing a double game that would have catastrophic consequences. Henry returned to England in triumph. He had won one of the most famous victories in English history. But he knew that one battle, however spectacular, wouldn't conquer France. He needed a sustained campaign, and he needed French cooperation. Henry returned to France in 1417 with a larger army and a systematic plan of conquest. Instead of dramatic chevauchées or risky marches, he focused on methodically reducing Normandy, the ancestral homeland of his dynasty. City by city, fortress by fortress, he ground down French resistance. Rouen, the Norman capital, held out for 6 months before starvation forced its surrender. By 1419, Henry controlled all of Normandy. He was within striking distance of Paris. The French government was paralyzed by the ongoing civil war. In September 1419, John the Fearless agreed to meet the Dauphin Charles, the heir to the throne, on a bridge at Montereau, supposedly to negotiate an end to the civil war. It was a trap. As John knelt before the Dauphin's attendants attacked him. They split his skull with an axe. They stabbed his body repeatedly. The Duke of Burgundy died on that bridge, murdered at what was supposed to be a peace conference. The assassination was a political catastrophe of the first order. John's son, Philip the Good, became the new Duke of Burgundy. He blamed the Dauphin for his father's murder, rightly so, since the Dauphin had clearly ordered it. And Philip made a fateful decision. He allied with England. The Treaty of Troyes, signed in May 1420, was the result of that alliance? Under its terms, Henry V would marry Catherine of Valois, the French king's daughter. He would be recognized as heir to the French throne, bypassing the Dauphin entirely. When Charles VI died, the crowns of England and France would be united under Henry and his descendants. The Dauphin Charles was declared a bastard. The treaty suggested that his mother's notorious infidelities meant he wasn't really the king's son and disinherited. He was banned from the succession. He was, legally, no longer a prince of France. Charles VI signed the treaty. He was mad, manipulated, controlled by the Burgundians and by his own wife, who apparently believed or was willing to claim that her son was illegitimate. The French government had surrendered. Henry V was now the acknowledged heir to France. When Charles VI died, he would be king of both realms. The disinherited Dauphin fled south of the Loire River with whatever supporters would still follow him. He established a rump government at Bourges, in central France. He called himself the Dauphin, then Regent of France, never quite claiming the royal title while his father lived, but never surrendering his claim either. His position seemed hopeless. He controlled perhaps a third of France, the poorer, less populated regions of the south and center. He had no money, few soldiers, and a reputation tainted by the Montereau assassination. The English and Burgundians controlled Paris, Normandy, and most of the wealthy north. Most observers expected the Dauphin's resistance to collapse within a year or two. Henry V would inherit France, unite the two kingdoms, and the great work would be complete. In August 1422, just 2 years after his triumph at Troyes, Henry V fell ill at the siege of Meaux. He had been campaigning relentlessly, never resting, driving himself and his soldiers to extend English control across northern France. The pace was unsustainable. His body broke down. The illness was probably dysentery, the same disease that had ravaged his army at Harfleur years earlier. Henry knew he was dying. He made arrangements for the regency, since his son was only 9 months old. He gave instructions for the prosecution of the war. He died on August 31st, 1422. Under the Treaty of Troyes, the infant Henry VI was now King of England and France. His uncle, the Duke of Bedford, would govern France as regent, continuing the conquest that Henry V had begun. But the Dauphin Charles also claimed the throne. He declared himself King Charles VII of France, though his enemies mockingly called him the King of Bourges after his provincial capital. The Duke of Bedford was a capable regent and a skilled commander. He maintained the Burgundian alliance, kept the English armies in the field, and continued the methodical reduction of Dauphinist territory. His forces won significant victories, including the Battle of Verneuil in 1424, which some called a second Agincourt. Charles VII, meanwhile, seemed incapable of effective resistance. He was not a natural leader. He was physically unprepossessing, thin, with weak legs and a face that seemed perpetually anxious. He had grown up in the chaos of his father's madness, surrounded by violence and treachery. The Montereau assassination followed him like a curse. His court was riven by factionalism. His counselors schemed against each other. His treasury was empty. His soldiers were unpaid and unreliable. Orleans was the strategic key to the south of France. It controlled the main crossing of the Loire River, the natural barrier that protected Charles VII's remaining territories. If Orleans fell, the English would be able to pour south, overwhelming the last Dauphinist resistance. The siege began in October 1428. The English built fortifications around the city, cutting it off from relief. Month after month, the noose tightened. Charles VII tried to raise a relief force, but the effort was half-hearted. He seemed paralyzed by despair. Some sources suggest he was considering abandoning France, entirely fleeing to Spain or Scotland, surrendering the kingdom to the English. France was dying. The war was lost. Everything the Valois had built was crumbling. And then a 17-year-old peasant girl arrived at Charles's court with an extraordinary claim. She said she had been sent by God to save France. Her name was Joan of Arc in the English spelling. She came from Domremy, a village on the border of Lorraine, far from the centers of power. Her family were peasant farmers, not nobles. She couldn't read or write. She had no military training, no political connections, no reason for anyone to take her seriously. But she claimed that the voices of Saints St. Michael, St. Catherine, St. Margaret had been speaking to her since she was 13. They had told her that she was chosen by God to drive the English from France and to see Charles VII crowned at Reims. It was an absurd claim, a peasant girl leading armies, changing the course of a war that had lasted nearly a century. The idea was laughable, but Charles VII was desperate. His situation was so hopeless that even a laughable idea was worth considering. And Joan had already demonstrated something remarkable. She had convinced the garrison commander at Vaucouleurs to give her an escort to the royal court, and she had predicted a French defeat at the Battle of the Herrings before news of it arrived. The meeting between Joan and Charles has become legendary. According to tradition, Charles disguised himself among his courtiers to test whether Joan could identify the true king. She walked past the decoys straight to Charles and knelt before him. "Gentle Dauphin," she said, "I am Joan the Maid, sent by God to aid you and the kingdom." Charles was skeptical but intrigued. He had Joan examined by theologians to ensure she wasn't a witch or a heretic. The examination took weeks. Joan answered every question, insisted on her divine mission, and never wavered in her conviction. The theologians concluded that they could find nothing wrong with her. She was either telling the truth or she was the most sophisticated deceiver they had ever encountered. He gave Joan armor, a horse, and a banner. He attached her to the relief force heading for Orleans. Whether she was actually given command is debated. The French nobles who led the army were not about to take orders from an illiterate peasant girl. But Joan's presence transformed the morale of the troops. The soldiers believed she was a sign from God. They believed that heaven was finally intervening on France's behalf. Joan arrived at Orleans on April 29, 1429. The relief of Orleans was not a single dramatic battle, but a series of assaults on the English fortifications surrounding the city. Joan was present at several of these attacks, carrying her banner into combat, rallying the troops, displaying a courage that shamed men who had been fighting for years. She was wounded an arrow through the shoulder during the assault on the Tourelles fortress, but she refused to leave the field. She pulled out the arrow herself, had the wound dressed, and returned to the fighting. By May 8th, the English were in retreat. The siege that had threatened to end French resistance was broken. It was a miracle. Everyone said so, friend and enemy alike. The English had been winning for years. Their military methods seemed invincible. And now a teenage girl had appeared from nowhere and shattered their momentum. She convinced Charles to march on Reims, the traditional coronation city, deep in English-held territory. It was strategically insane the French would be marching past English strongholds, exposing themselves to attack, gambling everything on reaching the cathedral before the English could stop them. They made it. On July 17, 1429, Charles VII was crowned King of France at Reims Cathedral, with Joan of Arc standing beside him, holding her banner. France had a king again, a legitimate king, anointed with holy oil, crowned in the proper place by the proper ceremonies. The Treaty of Troyes was effectively repudiated. The succession was established. The war was far from over, but the tide had turned. Joan of Arc's triumph at Reims was the high point of her career. Charles VII had been crowned. The immediate crisis was over. And the king who owed his throne to a peasant girl from Domremy began to distance himself from his savior. Joan wanted to march on Paris, to strike while French momentum was at its peak. She believed, and her voices told her, that the capital could be taken, that the English could be driven from France entirely. She was probably right. The English were reeling, demoralized by the disasters at Orleans and along the coronation route. A bold stroke might have ended the war. Charles hesitated. He preferred negotiation to combat. He opened talks with the Duke of Burgundy, hoping to detach him from the English alliance. The talks went nowhere, but they consumed precious weeks while English reinforcements arrived and English garrisons strengthened their defenses. When the French finally attacked Paris in September 1429, it was too late. The assault failed. Joan was wounded again, a crossbow bolt through the thigh, and the French withdrew. Over the following months, Joan continued to fight, but the magic was gone. Charles gave her less support. The nobles who had followed her at Orleans now questioned her judgment. The voices that had guided her seemed to fall silent on matters of strategy. In May 1430, during a skirmish outside the city of Compiègne, Joan was pulled from her horse and captured by Burgundian troops. She was a prisoner. The English wanted Joan dead, but they wanted her discredited more. If Joan was truly sent by God, then the English cause was damned. The victories she had won were divine judgments against English claims to France. Her very existence was a theological problem. But if Joan was a witch, if she was a heretic, a fraud, a tool of the devil, then her victories meant nothing. The English cause would be vindicated. God would still be on their side. They put her on trial. The trial of Joan of Arc was one of the most infamous judicial proceedings in history. It was held at Rouen in English-controlled Normandy, presided over by Pierre Coquin, the Bishop of Beauvais, a Burgundian partisan who had been driven from his diocese by Joan's campaigns and who hated her personally. The charges were numerous: heresy, witchcraft, dressing as a man, claiming direct communication with God without the mediation of the Church. The proceedings were rigged from the start. Joan had no legal counsel. Exculpatory evidence was suppressed. The judges had already decided on the verdict. And yet Joan defended herself with extraordinary courage and intelligence. She was 19 years old, illiterate, alone in a hostile court surrounded by trained theologians trying to trap her into heretical statements. She parried their questions with wit and conviction. When asked if she knew she was in God's grace, she replied, "If I am not, may God put me there? And if I am, may God so keep me." It was a perfect answer, humble, faithful, impossible to condemn. The trial dragged on 4 months. The judges grew frustrated. Joan refused to break, refused to admit that her voices were demonic, refused to deny her mission. Finally, they threatened her with torture. They showed her the instruments. Joan wavered. On May 24, 1431, Joan signed a document abjuring her claims, admitting that her voices had deceived her. In exchange, she was sentenced to life imprisonment rather than death. But the English weren't satisfied with imprisonment. They needed her dead. 3 days after her abjuration, Joan put on men's clothing again. Why she did this is unclear. Some sources suggest her women's clothes were taken away, leaving her no choice. Others suggest she reasserted her identity deliberately, knowing the consequences. She reportedly said that her voices had returned, reproaching her for the weakness of her abjuration. Whatever the reason, the act was fatal. Wearing men's clothing after abjuring was proof of relapse into heresy. There would be no second chance. On May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was burned at the stake in the marketplace of Rouen. She was 19 years old. The execution was designed to be as humiliating as possible. The platform was built high so the crowd could see her suffer. The fire was lit slowly so her death would be prolonged. An English soldier had fashioned a crude cross from 2 sticks, which Joan clutched as the flames rose around her. According to witnesses, her last word was Jesus. When the fire burned down, the executioner raked aside the coals so the crowd could see her charred body, proof that she was really dead, proof that she had been merely human after all. Then the fire was rebuilt and her remains were burned to ashes, which were scattered in the Seine. The English hoped they had erased her. They had only created a martyr. The death of Joan of Arc did not end French resistance. If anything, it strengthened it. Charles VII, whatever his personal failings, was now a crowned and anointed king. The Duke of Burgundy was growing disillusioned with his English alliance. The English themselves were exhausted, their treasury depleted by decades of war, their manpower stretched thin across 2 kingdoms. In 1435, the Congress of Arras achieved what Joan had hoped for but never lived to see: the reconciliation of Charles VII and Philip the Good of Burgundy. The Burgundian alliance with England was over. The civil war that had torn France apart for a generation was finally healing. Paris fell to Charles VII in 1436. The Reconquest accelerated through the 1440s. Charles reformed his army, creating permanent professional forces that didn't disband between campaigns. He reformed his finances, establishing regular taxation that provided steady revenue. He became the king that Joan had always believed he could be. Normandy fell in 1450. The English army sent to relieve it was destroyed at the Battle of Formigny, a reversal of Crécy and Agincourt, with French artillery and cavalry overwhelming English archers. Gascony followed. The final major battle of the war was fought at Castellane in 1453. The English commander, John Talbot, the terror of France for decades, was killed by a cannonball. His army was annihilated. By October 1453, only Calais remained in English hands. The 100 Years' War was over. France had won. The war that ended in 1453 had begun in 1337. 116 years of intermittent conflict, of battles and sieges and chevauchés, of plague and famine and civil war. The costs were almost incomprehensible. France had been devastated. Entire regions were depopulated by war, by plague, by the collapse of agriculture as farmers fled or died. Some estimates suggest that France lost half its population during the war years. Villages were abandoned, fields returned to forest. The great prosperity of the 13th century was a distant memory. England had poured its treasure and its blood into the continent for over a century and had gained nothing. The dreams of Edward III and Henry V, a dual monarchy, an empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, were ashes. England was left with Calais and with debts that would haunt it for generations. The political consequences were equally profound. France emerged from the war as a centralized monarchy, stronger than it had been before the conflict began. The independent nobles who had defied the crown were broken. The Estates General, which had challenged royal authority during the dark years, faded into insignificance. The French king was now an absolute ruler in ways that would have been unimaginable to Philip VI. England emerged from the war fractured and unstable. The loss of France discredited the Lancastrian dynasty. Within 2 years of Castellan, England would plunge into the Wars of the Roses, a bloody civil conflict between rival claimants to the throne that would last for 30 years. The medieval order itself was dying. The 100 Years' War marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The armored knight, the dominant warrior of medieval Europe, was obsolete. Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt had shown that longbowmen could destroy cavalry. Castellan had shown that artillery could destroy anything. The future belonged to gunpowder, not to chivalry. The feudal system, in which kings depended on their vassals for military service, was giving way to centralized states with professional armies paid from regular taxation. The French reforms of Charles VII pointed toward the absolutist monarchies of the future. The sense of a unified Christendom, of a single European civilization under the spiritual authority of the Pope, was fragmenting into distinct national identities. The English and French who fought each other at Agincourt thought of themselves as English and French in ways that their ancestors at Hastings would not have understood. The war had created nations. Joan of Arc was rehabilitated in 1456 when a papal court reviewed her trial and declared her innocent. The judges who had condemned her were posthumously disgraced. The verdict was officially nullified. Joan was declared a martyr who had died for her faith and her king. It was too late to save her, of course, but it preserved her memory, transformed her from a condemned heretic into a national saint. In 1920, nearly 5 centuries after her death, Joan of Arc was canonized by the Catholic Church. She became the patron saint of France, a symbol of national resistance, of faith against despair, of courage in impossible circumstances. Her story has been told and retold countless times in plays and operas, in films and novels, in historical studies and popular legends. She has been claimed by monarchists and republicans, by Catholics and secularists, by French nationalists and universal humanists. Everyone wants a piece of Joan of Arc, but the essential story remains: a peasant girl who believed she heard the voices of saints, who convinced a desperate king to trust her, who turned the tide of a war that had seemed lost, and who died for her faith at 19 years old. She was either what she claimed to be, a messenger from God, or she was something equally remarkable, a young woman of such extraordinary conviction and courage that she changed history through sheer force of will. Either way, her story illuminates something profound about the human capacity for faith, for sacrifice, for refusing to accept that the impossible is truly impossible. Let me end where we began, with a war that lasted 116 years. That's 5 generations. Great grandchildren fighting a war that their ancestors had started. Men dying for claims and grievances that predated their births by a century. Wars like this change everything about the societies that fight them. They become part of national identity, woven into the stories people tell about themselves. They create heroes and villains, martyrs and monsters. They establish boundaries, geographical, cultural, psychological, that persist long after the fighting ends. The 100 Years' War created England and France as we know them. Before the war, English kings spoke French and held French territories. After the war, England was an island nation, separate from the continent, developing its own distinct culture and institutions. France was a unified kingdom, no longer threatened by English claims, ready to become the dominant power of early modern Europe. The line that the war drew across the English Channel persists to this day. But perhaps the deeper lesson is about the nature of such conflicts, the way they take on a life of their own, consuming generation after generation, resistant to resolution, demanding sacrifices that no rational calculation could justify. The men who signed the Treaty of Troyes in 1420 thought they had ended the war. The men who gathered at Arras in 1435 thought the same. It took the complete military collapse of England to finally bring the fighting to a close. Somewhere in the mud of Agincourt, in the flames of Rouen, in the ashes of 1,000 burned villages, there's a warning about the wars we start and the forces we unleash. We don't always control how they end.